In this video, we're going to talk about the nature of industry. So we're going to be thinking about how different industries differ from each other on several different dimensions. Some things that we're going to be thinking about are how prices are determined in different types of industries. So how do the firms in those industries pick the prices that they charge? We'll talk about how a firm in different industries would pick its markup, or how much more above its cost it charges. And we'll also think about the different incentives to advertise in different industries. In some industries you see very little advertising, while in other industries you see a lot. So we'll be thinking about mainly three different categories of differences across industries. And we're going to start with market structure. So we're going to be thinking about ways that the market is structured in terms of the number of firms or the size of the firms. We'll be thinking about maybe cost differences or demand differences across different industries. And we'll also think a little bit about the ease of entry. And in upcoming videos, we'll be thinking about different types of market structures, and they will differ along those criteria. So let's start by thinking about just firm size. So in terms of firm size, I'm going to put a table up here, and this table basically just shows the largest firms in different industries. So you can see that the industries are listed along the left, and you've got the largest company in each of those industries, and then you've got the sales over on the right in terms of millions. And the numbers themselves are not interesting. Depending on when you're watching this video, these numbers in real life could be very different from what they are in this table. That's not what's important. What's important is simply that you can see that the total sales differs quite a bit across different industries. You can see that, at least in this table, the largest firm, the largest company is Walmart, with sales of $523 million. Actually, that's billion. That's 500,000 million. So that's a lot of sales. But this is 2024. If you were to go back 4 years, Walmart actually had 611 rather than 523. And so just in those few years, you can see that these numbers can change quite a bit. Walmart's sales have gone down from 2020 to 2024. There are several things that drive changes like that. Industries can change over time. Things can happen where laws change or regulations change. The conditions under which the businesses compete with each other can change. Firms can combine with each other, or firms can go out of business. Parts of firms can get sold off. And so lots of changes can take place over time. So again, the numbers themselves are not that important. It's really designed to show you the differences. In terms of industry concentration, let's talk about that for a second. So we can think about how concentrated an industry is. Some industries are very concentrated, and what that means is that a relatively small number of firms control a large chunk of the market. In other markets, for example, perfectly competitive markets, they're the opposite, where there's very low levels of concentration, meaning that you've got a lot of firms, each of which are small compared to the size of the market. So concentration has to do with how concentrated market shares are to a relatively small number of firms. Let's think about ways to measure concentration. So we can think about what's referred to as a concentration ratio. And there are 4 firm concentration ratios. I'll define that here in a second. There are also 8 firm concentration ratios. There's no reason you couldn't think of a 10 firm or 12 firm concentration ratio. But let's think about a 4 firm concentration ratio. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, let's let S1, S2, S3, and S4, let those represent sales of the top 4 largest firms in the industry. And then we'll think about S with a subscript of T to represent total sales. So the 4 firm concentration ratio, which we would typically designate with a C and a subscript 4, that 4 firm concentration ratio is nice and simple. You just add up the sales for the top 4 firms and then divide it by total sales in the industry. So it's going to be S1 plus S2 plus S3 plus S4 divided by total sales. Now there are a couple of ways that we can also think about that. One of the ways, since all of these things are added in the numerator and we've just got ST in the denominator, we could rewrite this as S1 over ST plus S2 over ST plus S3 over ST plus S4. And if we wrote it that way, then we could think about that 4 firm concentration ratio as just being equal to, if we called this the share, right? This would be, if S1 was the largest firm, then this would be the largest firm's share of the market. And so if we called those just W1 plus W2 plus W3 plus W4, we can think about the 4 firm concentration ratio in terms of sales numbers or in terms of shares. It's the same way, and if you were to look online, you'd find different sources will think about it differently, but it means the exact same thing. If there are a lot of small firms, then that concentration ratio gets small. And if, for example, there was only one firm, let's suppose we had a monopoly. Well, if there's only one firm, then that firm has 100% of the market share. And so the 4 firm concentration ratio would be 1. So that concentration ratio falls in between 0 and 1. The closer it is to 1, the more concentrated the industry is. We can also think of another way of measuring concentration in a market or in an industry, and that would be with what's referred to as the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, or the HHI. HHI stands for Herfindahl-Hirschman Index. And so the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is very similar to a concentration ratio, except it's the sum of the squared market shares, and then you multiply by 10,000. And the reason you multiply by 10,000 is to get rid of all the decimal places. It's kind of the same idea as how a batting average is talked about in Major League Baseball. You don't talk about a batting average as .325, you say that the batter's batting .325. You put it in terms of 325 rather than the decimal. And so that's what the 10,000 does here. The Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is just equal to 10,000 multiplied by the sum of all of the market shares, all of these, but you square each market share. Now, let's talk about what that does. That essentially gives more weight to the larger firms in the industry. So, it's going to do something very similar to a concentration ratio, but there's obviously going to be differences. It places a little bit more weight on the largest firms. Incidentally, you can also use a concentration ratio or the Herfindahl-Hirschman index to measure concentration in an industry, but you can also think about it, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index especially is used as a measure of competitive parity across sports leagues. So if you look at say a sports economics context and you were saying, okay, well, how fair is a league? In other words, how much parity is there? Is it the case that there's very little parity where you have one team that's pretty much most of the time winning all the championships, or are the championships relatively spread out across the teams in the league? And the Herfindahl-Hirschman index can be a measure of that. These shares would be the share of championships earned by a team over time. And so, for example, the New York Yankees have a higher Herfindahl-Hirschman index when it's applied to World Series than, say, the Kansas City Royals. Right? So, this is used in other areas. Let's think about another table here, and this table actually shows the four-firm concentration ratio and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. These numbers are from 2020. And basically, these tables come from the textbook, but if you look at the numbers, what you'll see is that typically the four-firm concentration ratio and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index tell you basically the same story. It gives you about the same ranking of industries, although you will be able to find some exceptions. So for example, if you look at motor vehicles in the table and you look at snack foods, you'll see that motor vehicles has a higher four-firm concentration ratio than snack foods, 68 compared to 53. But if you look at the HHI, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, you'll see that snack foods has a higher HHI than motor vehicles. And the answer to why that happens has to do with the fact that the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is placing slightly more weight in this summation on the biggest firms. But they're both pretty good ways of thinking and measuring concentration in an industry. Let's think about some limitations. The U.S. Census Bureau calculates the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, but actually what they do is they don't add it up across every firm that's in the industry. They actually only use the top 50. So that can be a limitation. And you might say, well, why don't they just go ahead and do it for all the firms? Well, it turns out that this isn't something you just sit down and do in a couple of minutes. This is time consuming and it requires a lot of estimation of sales and it requires a lot of data gathering. So they do it for the top 50 firms. It's also the case that the data is lagged. In that table that we had, the numbers were for 2020, but they were calculated using sales from 2007. And so the Herfindahl-Hirschman index at any given time is actually telling you something about concentration a few years back. And so you have to be careful with that. Things can change over time. It's also the case that there's no foreign firm that is included in the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. So it ignores foreign competition. It's only calculated for U.S. firms, which means that it tends to overstate the actual level of concentration. So if you think about the concentration of a particular industry, and you're ignoring the fact that there are some big firms that are in other countries, well, then these firms don't actually have that big a share of the market. So it's also the case that a market can have a different level of concentration at the local level than it would at the national level. So a perfect example of that would be if you look at concentration in the gasoline retail market, you'll see that that's very much like a perfectly competitive market. There's very little concentration on a nationwide basis there. On the other hand, if you were to look at gas stations in an area where maybe there's only a couple of gas stations, and if you were to restrict your interest to that area, you would see that in that area, regionally, the few gas stations that are in the market have a high amount of sales, or a high share of the sales in that regional area. So that's a limitation. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is calculated on a nationwide basis. It's also challenging because how you define the industry matters a lot. There's a lot of aggregation when they calculate the Herfindahl-Hirschman index across different products. So for example, the four-firm concentration ratio for soft drinks is 53. That means 53% of the soft drink market is accounted for by the top four firms. Well, if you're thinking Coke and Pepsi, then you would probably be surprised by that. You would say, wait, Coke and Pepsi have a much higher market share than that. And you'd be right if you were thinking about cola drinks. But the Herfindahl-Hirschman index is not calculated for cola drinks. It's calculated for soft drinks and beverages. And so what that means is that in that concentration ratio, it's not just cola drinks. It's I've got a list here: birch beer, root beer, fruit drinks, ginger ale, iced tea, lemonade. There are others. The question is iced tea a substitute for a Coke or a Pepsi? And it depends on consumers. For you, they might be substitutes. For a lot of people, they probably aren't. A lot of people aren't thinking, if they sit down, should I have an iced tea or a Coke? They're probably thinking, should I have a Coke or a Pepsi? So you have to be careful with that and your interpretation of the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. If you're thinking, well, okay, so how would we figure out whether two goods are complements for each, or strongly substitutes or weakly substitutes? Well, it would be the magnitude of the cross-price elasticity. So you would need a positive cross-price elasticity, and you would need it to be large in magnitude. The bigger the cross-price elasticity, the more substitutable the goods are for each other. In terms of market structure, we can also think about technology differences. So this will be my third thing here, technology. So it can differ in terms of market size, it can differ in terms of concentration, it can differ in terms of technology. Different technologies are used in different industries. And it can be the case that different firms in a single industry can have different technology. So some production processes are very labor intensive, some are very capital intensive. And so that matters in terms of what's going to happen in that industry. We could have a situation where some firms have access to better technology than other firms in the same industry. If all of the firms in an industry have the same technology, so I'm going to say same technology, let's think about how that would show up. Well, the technology shows up in terms of the production function. The production functions would be identical. And if we were thinking about those firms having access to the same market for inputs, then what that would lead to is the same cost curves. So typically, if we think about firms having identical technology, we would say, okay, those firms are all going to have identical cost curves. However, if some firms have better technology, so if we're thinking about a firm that's got better technology, then it would have lower cost curves. Better technology means that it can produce more efficiently, which essentially means that it needs less input to produce a unit of the output, meaning that its cost curves would be lower. If we were to draw the marginal cost and average total cost for these two groups of firms, then we would think about, let's suppose these are the firms with the regular technology, and then you've got some firms with better technology, then we would have their cost curves shifted down. Okay, or we could draw them on the same picture, and I would draw the marginal cost curve for the other firm below the marginal cost curve and average total cost curve for this firm. So this would be marginal cost 1, 1, marginal cost 2, average total cost 2. So better technology means that you're more efficient, you have lower costs of production. We can also think about differences in market structure in terms of demand and market conditions. So demand and market conditions. So let's think about what that would entail. If we're thinking about different market conditions, well, obviously the demand for different goods and services means being different across industries that's going to have a big impact on how the firms behave in the industry, right? In some industries, market demand is going to be really high, which might support a lot of firms being in the industry. In other industries, the market demand curve might be relatively low, meaning that that market could only support a few firms. They can also, in terms of demand differences, it could be it could be high demand versus low, high versus low demand. There can also be big differences in terms of consumer information. How much information a consumer has can lead to huge differences in how firms or industries behave. And so, for example, if you were to think about the market for airline tickets, the airline industry, consumers tend to have good information in that. With your phone or a computer, you can real quickly search for ticket prices from one location to another across different airlines. And for all practical purposes, what you're buying there is for that airplane to transport your body from one place to another. The experience and the fees might be a little bit different, but there's a lot of uniformity across the good there. And consumers have good information about how prices differ across firms. So compared to a lot of goods, there's relatively little price variability. Or you could think about the other end of the spectrum being, say, something like used cars, where consumers have relatively little information. And the price isn't just given to you and you pay that price. Typically, you negotiate a price. And you're not 100% sure what you're buying. That's why buying, especially a used car, can be very frustrating for a lot of people, because you're not exactly sure what you're going to get. There's a lot of stuff happening under that hood that you can't see as just a regular car consumer. And so what we tend to see there is large differences, all other things equal, large differences in the prices. And so consumer information and the availability of information has a big impact on the structure of the market. We can also think about elasticity of demand. So how much do the consumers react to changes in prices? So not just whether demand is high or low, but how steep is that market demand curve? Is it the case that if price goes up a little bit, one firm's price goes up a little bit, do consumers move away from that firm's good, or do they just quit buying the good altogether? Okay? That has a big impact on how a market or an industry functions, and we'll see that in some future videos. We'll talk more about that. Let's think about a measure of elasticity here in just a second. We didn't talk about this in the previous video where we were talking specifically about elasticities, but in this context, it's useful. Let's think about something that's called the Rothschild Index. What this thing is, the Rothschild Index, is typically designated with an R, and it is the elasticity, the total market elasticity divided by the elasticity for a particular firm's product. So it's a measure of the sensitivity to price of the product group as a whole relative to the sensitivity to the price that an individual firm charges for its product that it's selling. Okay, so if you think about what's going on there, a good example of this would be, let's say, if we think about Mountain Dew. So the elasticity of demand for Mountain Dew is higher than the elasticity of demand for soft drinks in general. And the reason is there are fewer substitute goods for that broader category of soft drinks than there are for the more narrow category of Mountain Dew. For Mountain Dew, there are all of the things that aren't soft drinks, but then also other soft drinks. Pepsi is a substitute for Mountain Dew. Dr. Pepper is a substitute for Mountain Dew. So this helps you figure out how much more elastic is a single firm's demand that it faces compared to the total market demand. This thing has to range between 0 and 1, where let's think about what it would mean if the Rothschild Index were 0. What that would mean is that this firm elasticity gets really big compared to the total market elasticity. That would be like the situation where you would have the situation a perfectly competitive firm would be in. So if we thought about perfect competition, remember with perfect competition, there are lots and lots of firms and they're all selling an identical product. That means if one firm raises its price, it's going to sell nothing because other firms are selling a perfect substitute. So the buyers will just go to the other firms. That's that example we talked about in the demand supply chapter where you've got a bunch of people in a room. I think the example I always use is that you're selling blue pens, and if you try to raise your price above the market price, you're going to sell nothing because everybody's just going to go to everybody else. In that case, the Rothschild Index would be 0. Or we could think about the other situation where we had a monopoly. If we had a single firm in the market, one firm with no competition, then because that firm is selling the only good, the firm's elasticity of demand would be the exact same as the market, the total elasticity of demand. And so these would be identical and R would be equal to 1. I'm going to clear this off and then we're going to talk about another thing under market structure. Another characteristic of the structure of the market, I'm going to start on this end now, is the potential for entry. Potential for entry. So different industries have different potentials for entry of new firms. When a new firm starts up in an industry, we call that entry. And so there are some industries where entry is very easy, and there are others where it is not easy at all. So let's think about if it's hard for a firm to enter. Let me give you examples where it's easy. So if you wanted to start a lawn care business, that's a relatively easy market to enter. You don't need any special licensing, typically. You might need to buy some equipment, but the capital requirements aren't that strenuous, and so you probably could enter that market fairly easily. There are lots of other markets where it's not easy at all. For example, if you wanted to practice law, there are some things that you need to do before you can practice law without getting in trouble. So let's talk about some of these things that are barriers that keep firms from entering. I'm going to call this sources of barriers to entry. And a barrier to entry, a barrier to entry can be strict or it can be not so strict. In other words, it can be a something that keeps all firms out, or it can just be a hurdle. So for example, if there was a law that kept all other firms out, well, that's a strict barrier to entry. If it's just the fact that you need to go pass the bar exam or you need to get a medical license before you can practice, well, that's a barrier to entry, but it's not strict. It's something that requires effort and time. So if we're thinking about sources of barriers to entry, an obvious one would be a patent. So that would be a situation where the government has created a situation that protects an inventor of a physical invention or an idea. It allows the inventor to be the sole person that can profit from that particular invention for a period of time. So it depends on the type of invention as to exactly what the period of time is. But you could also have some other government restriction, like a license. Licensing is also a situation very similar to a patent, where it's a government or some bureaucratic rule that keeps other firms out. You could also have a situation where you have very high explicit costs of entry. High explicit costs of entry. So for example, the explicit costs of entry, if you were going to start an airline, are incredibly high. You have to buy a fleet of planes, and that keeps people out of the market, right? It is one reason why there's a relatively small number of competitors in the airline industry. You could also have a situation where it's the cost curves, the structure of the cost curves that keep other firms out. I'm going to call it economies of scale. But I will also say that you may have heard of this because sometimes this is called a natural monopoly. So with a natural monopoly is a situation where there are economies of scale over the relevant range of production. So let's think about what economies of scale looks like. So remember, economies of scale we talked about in the cost chapter, and specifically we were thinking about a part of the long-run average total cost curve. So if we put up here costs of production, and down here we have the quantity produced in the market or in the industry, let's suppose the long-run average total cost curve looked like this. So there's our long-run average total cost. And remember, the downward sloping, as you increase output, the downward sloping portion of that long-run average total cost curve is the range over which the firm experiences economies of scale. There are benefits to getting bigger. We talked about the fact that a lot of long-run average total cost curves look like this. In fact, this would have been the picture that I drew for you. Over this range, there's economies of scale, then constant returns to scale, then diseconomies of scale. But let's suppose that the long-run average total cost curve just always slopes downward. Well, what this means is that there will be a natural tendency for there to be one big firm in this market. Let's suppose the total demand for the good in this market is right out here at Q. That's the total that all the buyers would buy in this market at a reasonable price. And let's suppose that we go up to that long-run average total cost curve and see what, on average, that would be the cost of producing, I'm going to say average total cost of producing that quantity Q. Well, you could say, well, why shouldn't we have two firms? What if instead of one firm producing that quantity, what if we had two firms, each producing half of that quantity? Well, if we did that, if we had two firms producing half, so there's half of the quantity, it's Q over 2. The problem is that the average cost for each of those firms would be higher than it would be if there was only one firm. And that just gets worse the more firms you've got. If instead of 2 firms each making half, what if we had 3 firms each making a third? A third would be about there, Q divided by 3. Well, then each of those 3 firms would have even higher average costs. So in a situation where you've got economies of scale over the relevant range of production, then there's going to be a tendency for there to be one firm. And that's not anything that any of these firms have done. It's just that there's some structural reason why that happens. We call this a natural monopoly because this is how costs tend to look in things like the water market. So the public utilities like electricity and water have cost curves that look like that. That's why a city has one water company and one electricity company typically. Even with an average total cost curve that looks like this, you can have this situation if the relevant range of production is that right there. If that is the relevant range of production, then there's economies of scale over the relevant range of production. You're going to end up typically with one firm in that market. So the potential for entry can depend upon several different things. Let's switch now. We talked about structure of the industry. Let's talk now about the conduct of the firms. So things can differ based upon conduct of firms. And here we're going to talk about several different things. Let's start by thinking about pricing behavior. So how the firm chooses its price, and then we're going to move on. We're going to talk about, let's see what else. We're going to talk about merger activity and firms integrating. And then there's one other one we're going to talk about. We'll get to that. Let's get back to price behavior. So in some industries, firms are going to have a higher markup than other industries. And the markup we typically define as the difference between price and marginal cost. So this is the price they charge. This is their cost of production. So for example, if I'm a firm and I'm producing a good and it costs me $6 to produce the good and I charge $10, then that means I've got a $4 markup. So $4 of that $10 price would be the markup. And so in some industries, firms have a large markup above their marginal cost, and in other industries, the markup is very, very small. With perfect competition, the markup ends up being zero. So we'll get to that in a future video. There's a measure of the markup in a particular market or industry called the Lerner Index. And the Lerner Index looks like this. It's defined as L, and it's nice and simple. It's just the markup divided by the full price. So in the story I gave you, where the price is equal to 10, and the marginal cost was equal to, 6, then 10 minus 6 would be 4. So I'm going to say L would be equal to 4 divided by 10. So it would be 40%, right? Or 4/10. So that would be the markup. 4/10 of the price is my markup above my cost of production. If price equals marginal cost, like it would in perfect competition, then L is equal to 0. The Lerner Index is 0 for perfect competition, and it gets bigger as firms have more market power. Market power is the word that we use to describe a firm's ability to charge a markup. Perfectly competitive firms have no market power. a monopoly has as much market power as it is possible to have. And then everything in between, a perfectly competitive firm and a monopoly has a little bit of market power, some market power. So let's talk about where this shows up in a picture. If you've had a Principles of Micro class before, then you've seen the markup. You've seen it in terms probably of monopolistically competitive firm and a monopoly. And you've seen the lack of a markup for a perfectly competitive firm. I'm going to show it to you now. We'll talk about it in an upcoming video a little bit more. So if we're thinking about a perfectly competitive firm, remember we've got our marginal cost curve. So this is perfect competition. And then we're going to look at how that would compare to a situation where there's a monopoly. And I'm going to put the marginal cost for the monopoly. The marginal cost, the cost curves aren't dependent upon the type of market that this firm is in. So the cost curves for a perfectly competitive, that should be perfect competition, would be the same as for a monopoly, at least in the market. But here, let's think about a firm in a perfectly competitive market. We've got price and quantity. And in this type of market, the way that the firm chooses the quantity is it looks at the market price, and the demand curve that that firm faces is perfectly elastic or horizontal at that market price. And that demand curve is equal to marginal revenue. And so the firm, remember, a decision maker takes an action if and only if the marginal revenue or the marginal benefit of the action is bigger than the marginal cost. You've taken the right amount of action when the marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal. Profit is maximized when a firm produces the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So for the perfectly competitive firm, they produce this quantity and they end up charging the market price. And if we wanted to identify the marginal cost of that quantity, we would go up from Q to the marginal cost curve. We hit it right there and we see that marginal cost and price are equal. That's why for a perfectly competitive firm, the Lerner index is 0, because price and marginal cost are equal. That's not how it works with a monopoly. A monopoly is the only firm in the market, and they face the market demand curve. And when you've got a downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue curve falls below the demand curve. The firm still maximizes profit by producing the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. That happens right there. So I'm going to call that QM. When we review monopoly, I'll call the monopoly quantity QM. And they charge a price that comes from the demand curve. So there's the price that a monopoly charges. Now let's figure out how that price right there relates to the firm's marginal cost. If we go up from the quantity to the marginal cost curve, we hit it right there. There's marginal cost. And right there's your markup. Right? Here's the firm's cost of production. There's the price they charge. So a perfectly competitive firm has no markup. Price equals marginal cost. A monopoly has a markup, and the size of the markup depends upon the steepness or the elasticity of this demand curve. It depends also on the shape of that marginal cost curve. Now, we can take that Lerner index and we can rearrange it. I'm not going to do the algebra, but it's very easy to show that you can rearrange it to look like this. P equals 1 over 1 minus L times marginal cost, where 1 over 1 minus L is what we call the markup factor. Let's think about some sizes of the markup factor. If we're thinking about L being equal to 0, if L is equal to 0, then this would be equal to 1. And if, let's say our markup factor, that's what I'm talking about, this whole thing, markup factor would be equal to 1. And so price would be equal to marginal cost. If we had L equal to 1/2, then the markup factor would be equal to 2. Price would be marked up higher than marginal cost. If we had L equal to 3/4, then the markup factor would be equal to 4. So this gives you a convenient way of thinking about the amount that a price gets marked up depending on the industry. Let me give you some examples. So if we think about some different sectors, and I'm going to give you the markup I'm going to give you L, and I'm going to give you the markup factor, and you'll see how these relate. And I think seeing the numbers will make it easy to understand exactly what is going on in this thing. So if you look at the wholesale trade, so buying things wholesale and selling them to retailers, L is 0.21 when we actually estimate it for firms out there in the industry, which means there's a markup factor of 1.27. So the markup is essentially 27% in that case. If we were thinking about finance, it's 0.24, which leads to a markup factor of 1.32. So in finance, things get marked up more than they get marked up in the wholesale trade industry. Actually, if you look at ag industry, so there we're talking about forestry and fishing and hunting, then L is 0.46, which means the markup factor is 1.85. It's higher in ag than it is in finance and a lot of other industries. So if we think about conduct of firms, we're thinking about pricing behavior. Let's also talk about integration and merger activity. This falls under the conduct of firms, so integration and merger activity. So integration, that's just the uniting of productive resources. So it could be a merger, or it could be if you integrate vertically with a supplier. We talked about that in a previous video. A merger, so that results in a larger firm. A merger also results in a larger firm. So typically that's a couple of firms merging together, and that merger could be friendly or it could be hostile. The reason for a hostile merger is to take over, fire the people who are running it, fire management, and put in new management to try to increase the profits of that particular business. We can think about 3 types of integration. We've actually already talked about 3 types of integration. We could have vertical integration. So vertical integration is a merger of different stages in the production process. So if you're running a car rental business, we talked about the possibility that you could choose to buy a car repair shop. Okay, and then that means you've cut out the middle person and you can repair vehicles, but you also have to run that car repair shop. So why would a firm do it? Well, remember we talked about in that video that it would be a way of reducing transaction costs. And specifically, we're talking about the transaction costs associated with acquiring inputs. Vertical integration, you're talking about steps in a production process, so you still end up with a single product here. So the firm still sells a single product. In other words, the car rental company is still just renting cars. They aren't doing auto repair for other people, for the general public. They're repairing their own vehicles. So vertical integration is multiple steps in a production process. You also could have what we call horizontal integration. And horizontal integration is the merging of similar products into one firm. So you could have, say, a soap manufacturer merge with a shampoo manufacturer. Why might firms do this? Well, there could be some similarities in the production process that lead to economies of scale. And if that's the case, then you could have a cost curve. You could be on this portion of your long-run average total cost curve, where putting these two firms together allows you to produce a larger output and benefit from economies of scale. There's also what's referred to as economies of scope. Economies of scope is where you're producing multiple products that tend to have things in common between them. Sometimes there's an input or multiple inputs in common. And there is a way to measure economies of scope. We're not going to cover it here, but if you're interested, I have videos on industrial organization and intermediate microeconomics, where you could go and you could find ways of measuring economies of scope. Or you could have, as another reason to do this, the desire to enhance market power. Maybe by merging a couple of different related products, it gives you the ability to have a larger market share. If there are cost reductions, well, that's good for society. Typically, that means if there are cost reductions, that all other things equal, the firm will usually charge a lower price in that case, which is good for consumers. On the other hand, when you have firms that merge, there's less competition. And so that's bad for consumers. The less competition, typically all other things equal, the higher the price is. So if we were thinking about whether or not a particular merger is good or bad, we'd have to see how those balance against each other. Do the cost savings outweigh the downside from having fewer firms? And the organizations that are in charge of doing that for the U.S. economy are the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. So the FTC and the DOJ, they're the ones that decide. They can dispute a merger. Okay? Typically, they don't dispute vertical mergers, but horizontal mergers, they certainly may. And the way that they usually decide that is based on some merger guidelines. And so those have to do with the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index and the percent of the market that the merged firm would have. So the guidelines are, right now at least, a Herfindahl-Hirschman Index in excess of 1,800 and a market share if the merger would increase it by 100 points or more, and the combined market share is greater than 30%. So if the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is less than 1,800, they're not too worried about it. They're probably not going to oppose it. But if the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index is in that range where it's 1,800 or above, and the merger would increase it by 100 and result in a 30% market share for the merged firms, the Department of Justice, the FTC, would probably oppose that and would have to argue in a federal court about whether or not that merger should be allowed. There's another characteristic, and that is if the combined market share is 30% and the merger increases, if it's 1,800 and it increases by 100 points, or if it's 1,800 and it increases by 30%. Those are the two conditions. It doesn't have to do both of those. Now, there can be some situations where it could do both of these, but the FTC or the Department of Justice may decide that they don't oppose it. And one of the big times when the Department of Justice decides that they're not going to oppose it is if there's significant foreign competition. Because remember, the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index does not measure foreign competition. So it could be in this range of 1800 or above, and yet still not have the industry not be very condensed because there's a significant amount of foreign competition. So those are the first two types of mergers. You could also have what's called a conglomerate merger. And a conglomerate merger is kind of a weird one. That's a situation where a firm just buys two or merges two companies with completely different products. So with horizontal, usually the products are similar to each other. But with conglomerate, it might be a cigarette manufacturer that buys a cookie manufacturer. And you might say, well, golly, the inputs that you need to make those aren't related to each other typically. And so you're probably not going to get cost savings. And there's really not any one argument for why a firm might want to do this. It could be that a firm might want to do it for cash flow reasons. Maybe it merges two businesses that have cash flows that are high at different parts of the year, and that allows the firm to smooth out its cash flow overall. That's one argument that some people have put forward. Another argument might be that maybe you've got a corporation with a really good CEO, and so you buy another completely unrelated business because that CEO is versatile enough that they can manage both of them and do a really good job. And they're good enough that it's worth it to have them run both of them rather than to have them run one and a mediocre CEO run another one. I don't know that that's a good explanation or not, but so we've talked about pricing behavior. I'm going to clear this off and then we'll come back and talk about research and development. All right, let's think a little bit about research and development. So industries differ in terms of the amount that firms tend to invest in research and development. And this isn't something that we need to go into a lot of depth on. If you're interested in that, you can look at other places to get more information. But I'm just going to say I've got some numbers here. If you were to look at the amount of research and development as a percentage of sales in, say, pharmaceuticals. Research and development as a percent of sales is about 20.6%. And if you were to look at in the food industry, it's about 0.8%. So you can see there's a lot of difference between how much research and development money gets spent in the pharmaceutical industry versus the food industry for probably obvious reasons. In terms of the optimal amount of research and development that a firm should engage in, it depends on the industry. In terms of the automotive industry, that number would be 5.2%. There's also differences in terms of advertising, and we'll talk more about this later on in the class, but advertise. Firms have different incentives to advertise depending on the industry that they're in. So if you were to look at advertising in the pharmaceutical industry, advertising dollars as a percent of sales is about 17%. In the food industry, it's about 5%. So you can see relatively little dollars spent on research and development in food, but 5% spent in advertising. And we'll talk about why that is. Typically, the more firms there are and the more identical or the closer the goods are to each other, there's less incentive to advertise. On the other end of it, the fewer firms there are, and the more different the goods are, the more differentiated the goods, the higher the incentive to advertise. So we've talked about structure of the industry, we've talked about firm behavior. Let's talk about performance of the industry. Performance of the industry. And what we mean here, this is something we're going to spend more time talking about in our last couple of chapters, but specifically what we're looking at here are what do profits look like for the firms in a particular industry, and what does social welfare look like? Now, remember, when we talk about social welfare in an economics class, we're not talking about the welfare system. Here we're talking about consumer and producer surplus. Okay? So in terms of profits, profits vary across different types of industries. And in terms of social welfare, the same. Here we're talking about consumer surplus and producer surplus. What we'll see is the more market power that firms have, all other things equal, the smaller consumer surplus will be and the bigger producer surplus will be. Not surprisingly, right? The more market power firms have, the better off they're going to be relative to the consumers in that market. In terms of social welfare, these are easy to measure when I draw pictures on a board. Remember, these are measured as typically triangular areas under demand curves or above supply curves. In the real world, these are much more challenging to measure. There's something called the Dansby-Willig Performance Index. So Dansby-Willig Performance Index. And what that is a measure of how much social welfare, how much total surplus would increase if you make a small increase in the industry quantity. So if more output was produced in the industry, would total surplus go up, and by how much? So we don't need to get into that. You can find information online of the Dansby-Willig Performance Index that's been estimated for different industries. We're not going to worry about it. So now let's just kind of summarize the three things that we've talked about. We've talked about the structure of an industry, we've talked about firm conduct in an industry, and we've talked about performance in an industry. And it's tempting to think that there's this causal relationship where what you have is market structure, and that market structure determines the firm behavior, and then based upon that firm behavior, what comes out is these measures of performance, the amount of profit and the well-being of buyers and sellers, total surplus. That's kind of what we would describe as a causality view. Market structure causes firm behavior. Turns out that it's probably not that way. It's probably a much more interrelated relationship between market structure, firm behavior, and performance. In other words, sometimes the market structure is determined by what firms do. We'll talk about that specifically when we're thinking about oligopolies. And so rather than looking at this causing that, which causes that, it's probably that all of these things are related. The way that a firm may choose to make decisions is dependent upon what profits are going to look like in that particular market. And so the market structure can be a result of these two things. Okay? And that's a little bit more complicated way of thinking about it, but it's probably also more realistic. If you go back and you think about the first video that we talked about in this particular class on managerial economics, the first one we talked about, we thought about some characteristics of a good manager, and a good manager had to take into consideration a bunch of different things. I think we listed 5 of them, and they were the potential for entry, the market power of input suppliers and the market power of the sellers, the rivalry between the firms in an industry, and then understand the nature of substitutes and complements. And all of those things that a good manager needs to be able to do are related to what we're talking about here. It's kind of a different angle to look at the exact same thing from. Let's talk now about what the next set of videos are going to look like. We've talked about a lot of stuff here, specifically in this video and in a couple previous ones, about the nature of industry and how things work for firms in an industry. What we're going to do now is we're going to talk about those different types of market structures that an industry can fall into. And we're going to start by thinking about, on one end of the spectrum, we're going to think about perfect competition. That's a situation where there's as much competition as you can possibly have. Now, the other end, sometimes I refer to this as the competitive spectrum. Different textbooks call it different things. It doesn't even need a name. At the other end of this kind of range of competition, here's as much competition as you can have. You can also go to this other end and think about a monopoly. That would be as little competition as you could have. One firm. A monopoly is where there's one firm. And what we're going to see is that with perfect competition, these firms aren't going to be able to earn a positive economic profit. A monopoly, typically, if people want to buy what it's selling, will be able to earn a positive economic profit, even in the long run. And so it's going to be good to be a monopoly, again, if you're selling something that people are wanting to buy. If you all of a sudden right now had a monopoly on the sale of VCRs, well, that's not going to do you any good. But if you're selling something that people want to buy and you're the only seller, that's a great place to be in. So we're going to talk about both of those types of situations. We're also going to talk about another market type called monopolistic competition. And that's closer down here to the perfect competition end. So monopolistic competition, this is the most common type of market. And then at the end, we're going to be talking about oligopoly. And oligopoly is where you have just a few firms. So if you think about how much market power firms have, down here they have none, and as you go in this direction, the firms are going to have more and more market power. We'll also see that in a lot of situations, even though some of these firms have market power, they're not going to be able to make a positive economic profit. So we're going to be thinking, as we talk in their next videos about these types of markets, we're going to be thinking about all of these things. We're going to be thinking about what consumer and producer surplus look like and looking at profits. And we're going to be thinking about the incentive to advertise and the incentive to engage in research and development. So I'll see you in those videos.